The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ are the foundation events of Christianity. Without them, real Christianity just couldn't exist. The death of Jesus is the point at which sin was forgiven and the way was open to God. And because of that, it is the most significant event in human history. This presentation is about the events of the day of the crucifixion and what happened on the day that Jesus died. And it's about how we know that the gospel accounts of that day are accurate. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like the video, and let us know in the comments how you think we've done in terms of presenting the events of the day of the crucifixion. I'm going to start off by talking about the way we represent time here. I've got a clock, and it's a 24-hour clock. There's midnight at the top. At the bottom, we have noon, and 6 o'clock in the morning is on that side, 6 o'clock in the afternoon is on this side. The crucifixion happened at Passover time. That's around the equinox. So sunrise and sunset would be at about 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. Now, sometimes there's an issue here. People ask, how come that Jesus died on the day before the Passover and the Last Supper was on the day before the Passover? Well, it's fairly simple. Jewish days start at sunset. The Last Supper starts just after sunset, and the rest of the day is the day on which Jesus was crucified. So both of them happen on the same Jewish day. Of course, it's quite different with a modern day. And the set of events is quite large. There's a huge number of things that happen. There's the Last Supper. Jesus prays in Gethsemane. He's arrested. He's interrogated by the authorities. He's tried and convicted by the Sanhedrin. He is taken up to Pilate, where he's sentenced. He's quick visit to Herod just to make sure, and then he's crucified, and finally he is buried. And that all happens in this period of 24 hours, one single day. And it's an event that was well known. It makes it into the Talmud. On the eve of the Passover, it says they hanged Jesus. And it's noted by several Roman historians. There's one of them, that's Tacitus. He's the earliest of them. So less than 100 years later, Tacitus is writing that Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the death penalty at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So let's go back and look at the day. It starts at sunset. At sunset, Jesus sends two of his disciples into Jerusalem and tells them to follow someone with a jar of water who will lead them to the room where they're going to have a meal. And these two disciples, Peter and John, they follow the person with the jar of water, and they find the house with the upper room. Jesus and the disciples follow on, and they eat a last meal together before Jesus is arrested. The room they eat in is a large guest room. It's upstairs. It's known as the upper room, and you can track that through the Bible. You can track it through other Gospels. You can track it through the Acts of the Apostles, and you learn a lot about it and the people who owned that house, includes John Mark. At that meal, they had the meal. At the end of it, Jesus shares a loaf of bread and a cup, which you can deduce contain wine, with the disciples. And this is a ceremony which is there to remind them, and remind us for that matter, of how Jesus died and rose from the dead. And that's been carried out by Christians ever since, for nearly 2,000 years. It's there to commemorate the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and to remind us that Jesus promised to return. At the end of the Last Supper, Jesus leaves the upper room with his disciples. Judas has peeled off. He's left the group, and he's gone off to the priests, and he's getting them, telling them that they can go and arrest Jesus later on if they want to. Jesus and the disciples walk through the streets of Jerusalem. The route I have put there is a complete conjecture. Who knows how they got there, but it does seem appropriate that he walks through the temple. On the way, there's a discourse. He talks to the disciples and tells them a whole lot of things about the coming of the Holy Spirit, which is going to allow them to write scripture later on. And there's a prayer, which again, it would be appropriate if that happened outside the temple, although we don't know for definite it did. Jesus arrives in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is here. The temple is there. That's the traditional site of it. May be completely wrong. The Romans destroyed everything around Jerusalem in 70 AD, and that would include this garden. So it is just a conjecture. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays. His disciples doze away. They're late at night. They're tired. But he prays for maybe 3 hours, maybe a little longer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then the priests get their acts together. They're rather surprised that Judas turns up in the middle of the night, says you can arrest Jesus now. They have to get together an arresting party, but they do that, and they go out and they take Jesus, and Jesus is arrested. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning now. Jesus is arrested by a party led by Judas. Judas identifies Jesus. He gives him a hug and a greeting kiss, and pretending to be his friend, betrays him. And Jesus is taken by the guards, and they take him away to the residence of the high priest. Again, we don't know where that was, but we do know that there were priestly residences around this bit of Jerusalem. Peter and John, very, very bravely indeed, follow on, and they also manage to slip into the courtyard of the high priest's residence. So while Jesus is upstairs being interrogated, they are down in the courtyard outside, and they can hear and to some extent see what is going on. The other disciples run away. They flee from Jesus, and they disappear into darkness, and they cower behind bushes and trees. But after the arresting party's gone, most of them reappear. And they gather together in the Garden of Gethsemane. Thomas has disappeared. He's gone out of the garden, and we don't hear about him again this day or the next day or even the day after that. But John Mark, the son of the people who own the upper room, he's been sent out to sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. He nearly got arrested as well, but he's standing there, and the others emerge from behind the bushes and all the rest of it, and he takes them back to the upper room, and there they remain again. Not just this day, they spend that night there, they spend the next day there, they spend the night after there, and that's where they meet Jesus later on. At the high priest's residence, Jesus is interrogated. The priests haven't got a case together against him yet, and they're making one. They're interrogating witnesses. They're making sure that all the evidence is ready so they can get a conviction when Jesus is tried later on in the day. Jesus is occasionally beaten. He's certainly abused, and they are putting together a case against him. But when dawn comes, Jesus goes down to the Sanhedrin house. The Sanhedrin meets. As soon as it's light, they ask him one question: are you the Christ, the Son of God? Jesus says, yes, I am. They say, there you are. That's blasphemy. We can condemn you on the spot. And this must be one of the shortest trials that there has ever been. John and Peter appear to have been outside the Sanhedrin. They know what's going on, and they appear to return to Pilate's residence for the next part of the event. So Jesus is condemned by the Sanhedrin immediately. He's taken up the hill to the praetorium. Notice this isn't the place that normally is thought of. Very often the guides and the tourist guides will tell you it's here, the Antonia Tower, but almost certainly it's the Herodian Palace up there at the top of the hill. There they want Pilate to condemn Jesus to death, something that only the Romans are allowed to do. The priests aren't allowed to do that. And it seems that John and Peter are in the crowd outside as well. Again, they can report what is going on. Pilate is reluctant to condemn Jesus. He thinks Jesus is an innocent man, which he is. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to upset his own political career. And in the end, Pilate agrees that maybe he's going to have to put Jesus to death. He sends Jesus away to Herod's palace so that he can go and be condemned by Herod. After all, he's a Galilean and Herod is the king of Galilee. But after a little while, Herod sends him back and leaves the decision to Pilate. So by now, we are something like 8 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours after Jesus has been arrested. In that time, Jesus has been condemned. He's been beaten. Pilate is trying to raise some sympathy for him, so he brings Jesus out. Jesus is bleeding. He is dressed up in a mockery of a king's robes. He has a crown of thorns on his head, and Pilate says, "Behold the man." And he's, I think, hoping for some kind of humanitarian response from the crowd, but it doesn't happen. The crowd shouts for a different person to be released, Barabbas, and Jesus is condemned to be crucified. Well, the place that's crucified is called Golgotha, the place of the skull, and Jesus is sent there to be crucified. He's by now in a very bad way. He's been beaten rather more than will be ordinary for a crucifixion victim. He can't carry the crosspiece of the cross that he'd been given to carry, and he has to be helped on the way, and someone is fetched out of the crowd, a man called Simon of Cyrene, who carries the crossbar to Golgotha for Jesus. At Golgotha, Jesus is nailed to his cross and he's raised onto it, and there he is going to die. When Jesus is crucified, he's placed between two robbers, two other people who are going to be crucified as well. There's a crowd around, the priests, and they mock Jesus. They shout abuse at him. Even the other victims join in. And one of them in the end changes his mind, gets forgiven, but Jesus is on the cross. And there's this flurry at the start, but then it settles down to a long wait. Jesus is crucified. It says at the third hour, that's 9 o'clock in the morning, and he's on the cross for 6 hours. Crucifixion is an unpleasant way of dying. It depends on people hanging from a cross, and just gradually the blood and the bloody fluids drain away, and they end up either dying of asphyxiation or of congestive heart failure, or simply what's called hypovolemic shock as the blood dries up in their body. Jesus is on the cross for 6 hours, and during that time, other interesting phenomenon happens, because there's darkness over the land from the 6th hour, that's noon, to the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, that's interesting. That's something that you would expect to be noticed by astronomers, and it was. Julius Africanus wrote this in about 220 AD. He says, Thales, in the third book of his Histories, explains this darkness as an eclipse of the sun, unreasonable as it seems to me. Well, Thales was writing a text of natural events. He's writing semi-astronomical textbook, and he is trying to explain the darkness that happened over the land. But you don't get eclipses of the sun at Passover, it's full moon, and eclipses of the sun don't happen at full moon. Sadly, we haven't got Thallus's book. We only have a few quotations of it in other books. So Julius Africanus quoted it, and Theophilus of Antioch in about 180 AD is a Christian writer who also quotes from Thallus. Thallus is writing the second half of the 1st century AD, could be as early as 52 AD, could be as late as the 90s. We can't be certain. And there's another astronomer, a chap called Phlegon, who also mentions the darkness, and he is cited by Julius Africanus and Origen, although again we don't have his complete work. So there's a darkness over the land, and at the end of that, Jesus is able to shout out a few more words, and then he dies. At the cross, we have a series of women. Now, they probably all didn't arrive at once. We don't know when they did arrive. They may not even have all been there at exactly the same time. And different gospel writers record different women. And they record them in different names. So Matthew records Mary Magdalene. In fact, they all record Mary Magdalene. And he records Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. James the Less is one of Jesus's disciples. Joseph is unknown elsewhere. It's not a disciple. And Mark refers to the same person. Luke just refers to as Mary, the mother of James. And John tells us that she's the wife of Cleopas. Well, James and Joseph, they were the sons of someone called Alphaeus, but often people did have two names. The Aramaic would be Chalpai, comes out of Alphaeus, one way of writing it, but a Hellenized version, a Greek version of it would be Cleopas, the male equivalent of Cleopatra. So we've got the same person, but under different names in different Gospels. Third woman was there is the mother of the sons of Zebedee in Matthew. Mark gives her a name. He calls her Salome, and John tells us that he was the sister of Jesus's mother. So we have, again, same person, but three different names. And you can put that together and get a sort of family tree out from it. So Mary's the mother of Jesus, and she's the sister of Salome. And John the disciple and a different disciple called James, they must be Jesus's cousins because of that. Luke mentions a woman called Joanna, does not mention any other gospel, and John talks about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, isn't there for very long. She's there at the start, and Jesus hands her into the care of John, and John takes her back to the house that his family owns in Jerusalem. Jesus dies at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It says about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice and died. So he's probably dying of congestive heart failure there. They need to make sure he's dead. Soldiers are going around. They're going to break the legs of the other two victims. It's only a few hours now before sunset, and they want to make sure these people are dead and off the cross and in a tomb by the start of the Jewish Passover. It's important not to cause yet more offense to the Jews in the area by having a dead body hanging on a gibbet or a cross just through the Jewish festival. So they break the legs. You don't have to hang very long if you can't support yourself on your legs, and you just hang by your arms, and you're going to die 20 minutes to half an hour. So they come to Jesus. Jesus is already dead, so they make sure they stick a spear in his side. That's recorded by John in his gospel. Notice what it says. Out came blood and water. There's a clear fluid, looks like water. That would be body tissue fluid that you might get collecting in the lungs. And we've got blood. Some organs do bleed after death. The fact that it comes out from his lungs shows Jesus was dead, because there's a negative pressure in your lungs during the time when you're alive. The other thing we've got in this passage is John telling us that he is an eyewitness. John saw this, and he's telling everyone, I saw this. It's something that has a witness to it. So Jesus is died, definitely dead. But there's a bit of time before his side is pierced, and Joseph of Arimathea goes to ask Pontius Pilate for the body. He's going to bury it. Now, was quite common, apparently, for crucifixion victims to be taken away and buried by their families. We now have 3 graves where there's a crucifixion nail in with the body. In one case, it's stuck in the bones in a way that they couldn't get it out. The other 2, it was probably stuck in the flesh. Things have gone a bit since then, and they're separate. And there are a whole lot more crucifixion nails been found in tombs, but not clearly associated with any particular body. It's actually quite commonplace to find them. So it was a custom for crucifixion victims to be buried in private tombs. And Joseph of Arimathea is a wealthy man. He has a new tomb in Jerusalem, and he goes to ask Pilate for the body. Now, this is taking time. He's got to walk from Golgotha to the Praetorium. He's got to get in. He's got to find Pilate. He's got to be given the permission to actually talk to him. But Pilate grants him the body, and Joseph of Arimathea then, well, he grants the body. He finds out, first of all, whether Jesus is already dead. So he has to send back to Golgotha, find out whether Jesus is dead. Yes, he is. So we're talking now perhaps an hour after the death of Jesus, maybe more than that. And Joseph goes out and he buys a linen shroud. By some quirk of fate, he didn't carry a burial shroud around with him. He has to go out to the market and buy one, something specifically permitted in the Talmud. On the eve of the Passover, you could buy a wedding garment or a burial shroud. And he goes out to the market, probably it was open anyway, and he goes and buys a linen shroud. And finally, Jesus is buried, and that must have been shortly before sunset, but he's under the ground before the Passover starts, and that's the important thing. How do we know that these accounts are accurate? Well, first thing to notice is that all the way through they contain differences in wording and in detail. Some things are mentioned in one gospel but not in another. People have slightly different names. Is it the mother of James that everyone knew, or the mother of James and Joseph, which physically she was, but no one knew who Joseph was. So there is so much difference in the text that more than you get anywhere else in the Gospels, so much difference that we can consider those accounts to be independent of one another. They're not just copies of one original account, but they fit together extremely well to produce a consistent narrative. I've just gone through the main narrative here, but it's not just in the main narrative, it's also true in the details. If you go and look at the details of the upper room, you'll find that there's a consistent set of details about that. Or if you look at the way that John had a pied-à-terre in Jerusalem, and John's family owned some kind of lodging there, that appears every now and again as a little detail in the accounts. Or if you start finding out what John Mark was doing on that day, again, he appears at various different times, and you can find out what's going on. If you look at the geography of the city, you'll find that the city fits the description in the Gospels quite nicely. That's something that we know because archaeologists have dug it up, and in fact things like the Talmud talk about it. But in 70 AD, Jerusalem was completely destroyed. It'd be very hard for someone who hadn't got a memory of that time to make everything fit in with the geography of Jerusalem. And finally, the details of the crucifixion are completely consistent with modern medicine. We know what would happen in crucifixion. There have been experiments done to confirm it, and the picture in the Gospels exactly fits what those say. So here's a question for you. Does the consistency of the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion show that the Gospels provide an accurate record? Let us know what you think in the comments with this video. So we've come to the end of the day. Where is everybody? It's sunset. Well, the places I've had to make up, quite quite honestly, we don't know where most of them are. So John has, or John's family have a house in Jerusalem somewhere. I put in the north of Jerusalem because it makes it easy to put the arrow on. And in that house, we have John, of course, and Peter, who stays with John throughout the day. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was sent by Jesus so that John could look after her. He's taken her back. Salome, who's John's mother and the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, staying in that house. After all, it's her house, and she's helping to comfort Mary, who's just lost her son. And it turns out Mary Magdalene stayed there as well. And on the accounts of the resurrection day, that's where she goes from. As I said, we don't know where John's house was. We've got a slightly better idea where the upper room was, although it's only a slightly better idea. And here we've got Mark, the writer of the gospel, and we have 8 of Jesus's 12 disciples, and they're staying there and they're keeping very quiet. We do know where Herod's palace was. That's been found by archaeologists. This is the palace put up by the Hasmoneans. Herod the Great built a rather better palace here. And that was taken over by the Roman governor. And Herod, who is now governed, this is a son of Herod the Great, is governing Galilee. When he stays in Jerusalem, he can stay in the old place. And that's down there. And Joanna is the wife of Herod's staff manager, steward, and so she'd be staying there. And the other one is Cleopas and his wife, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. Again, I have no idea where they will be staying, but they have somewhere to stay in Jerusalem. And the only one we're missing now is Thomas. He disappears into the night at the arrest, and we have no idea where he spent the night. I've speculated wildly that he went to Bethany, but it could be almost anywhere. So at the end of the day, the different people have different thoughts. The disciples are devastated. They had trusted in Jesus. They had known he was the Messiah. They were expecting him to set up the kingdom of God and to rule forever. And here he is dead. So they are devastated. They've no idea what's going on. The Romans, well, they're quite thankful because they've got through another day without any really serious riots. And that's a plus for them. They don't think anything else is going to happen. They can put things quietly to bed. But the priests are jumpy. They're expecting something to happen because that evening they want a guard to be placed on the tomb of Jesus, and they demand one and they get one. Well, the next day is a Sabbath, nothing's going to happen. But on the following Sunday, everything does change and the world changes with it. So it's a day when lots of things happen. It starts at sunset and ends at sunset. There's a whole series of events that take part during it. And for 6 hours, Jesus hangs on a cross and is killed. And those 6 hours are 6 hours that change the world.